Hello, Global Theater. My name is Jerry Fialka. Today is June 8th, 2022. We want to thank Rob Grant and his amazing podcast. I'm probably wrong about everything. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here with Ted Lewis. Ted, where are you calling in from?
Duluth, Minnesota.
How cool is that? I'm in Venice, California, and the first question is, what's the best thing for a human being?
The best thing for human beings for thriving is drinking raw milk.
Oh, how cool is that? So, does that milk, is that cow's milk or mother's milk?
Well, I'm thinking cow's milk mostly. I consider it to be white gold because it's just so nutritious. If it's clean, you got sterile containers, there's nothing better on the earth.
Great answer. What's your favorite form of information, Ted? How it comes into you?
Sensory perception.
Wow. So, for the layperson, how would you describe sensory perception in a few other words?
It means I trust my observations. Um, like Leonardo da Vinci, he would watch a bird for the longest time and just observe it so well that he started thinking about how do those wings work? How do they stay in the air? Well, that's how I think about things like human immunity, or I think about how even the topic of information. How do people get information and what do they do with it? I think about it from an observation standpoint, and I watch how their lives are affected. I watch their emotions. So to me, I trust my direct experience uh, over all the written information I might be getting from other people.
Love that word, direct experience. I love to hear that. I actually get that answer often. Why do you think humans collect or gather information?
Well, we're sentient beings, and part of our survival, because we can't really, uh, we can't take on a tiger, is we have to think about our survival, and we also are communal beings. We also love to make culture, and all of these things involve a rational aspect as well as an imaginative aspect and an intuitive aspect. So it's collecting information is part of how the brain works. That's how herbal medicine started. People had to observe and think about what are the benefits of this particular plant for our medicinal use, and that takes a lot of information gathering and then sifting out.
You probably answered this, but I'm going to ask it anyways. Do you think this need or want to collect information is more innate or more invented?
I think it's innate. I don't think it's like modern humans are somehow way better than their Stone Age counterparts, because those brains had to collect information and constantly weigh things out. And animals do that all the time. I went in my backyard today and there were two deer resting on the grass, lying down, and they saw me, and I was quiet and gentle, and they stayed there. But they are constantly collecting information about me, and it lasted for about 5 minutes. They were collecting information about, am I going to be trustworthy or am I a threat? And eventually I started moving around too much, and their information led them to leave. But that's an example. Information is gathered intuitively, and then of course our more rational brains have to organize information into systems, into models. Uh, we have to take the planets and stars and put them into charts and think about time frames, and all of that starts to complexify what we do with information.
You sure touched on a lot of what we're going to go into, and I really appreciate how articulate you are, Ted. Thank you. Um, do thoughts create emotions?
I don't know if I have a quick answer to that. certainly they're sort of symbiotically related, but ultimately our emotions can sometimes uh, try to sway what we know best in our thoughts. Like we might know that um, we have to sort of surrender ourselves to, say, a medical procedure, but our emotions might be saying, "I don't want to do this," or I don't want to surrender to what the doctor is suggesting." So always related. Um, I don't. I put intuition into a third category. I don't think of intuition as emotion, but I think of it as more in the frontal part of our brains that weighs information, and we either learn how to trust it or we learn how to ignore it. Um, and it has to do with sensing things and hunches, and maybe we can get back to some of that when it comes to how do we navigate news media in our world.
I like the word hunch. That's what I'm after in this regard. Any of these questions that sound absurd or, I'm not a neuroscientist, I can't answer that. I'm more after your hunch. So fill in the blank. I don't know what I think until I.
Can you come at that one from a different angle?
Boy, that is brilliant. Yeah, I'll give you the roots of it. McLuhan said, I don't know what I think until I say it. Joan Didion says, I don't know what I think until I write it. So, I mean, I could guess with what you've already said, what you would say, but that could be a different angle.
Yeah.
But you want me to try that, or do you want to
No,
try it?
I think I got enough there. I've been reading a lot about the idea that poetry is part of the human legacy of imagination, and it's related to even how language is created. So I'm finding in my own life that um, I know I've really thought about something and understood something well enough if I can put it into a poem that I like.
Brilliant. Yeah. So I don't know what I think until I write a poem about it. It's good. Really good. Can humans think without language?
I don't know if I've ever thought about that. I would say no.
Chomsky says that a language is not just words, it's a culture, a tradition, a unification of community, a whole history of what creates what a community is. What do you do when language doesn't work, when language breaks down?
Well, in my field of restorative justice, I often talk about heart language. And I tell people that the heart language is where people connect, even if it's not even on a verbal level. They're connecting on kind of an empathetic level or a common humanity level. Whereas if people who are dealing with harms and conflicts only stay in a head zone, then they clash or they
Yeah.
protect or
Mm-hmm.
they go on the offensive or the defensive. And it's in those zones where language becomes more like powerful. Knowledge is power. Words are used to protect, to throw darts, and so I'm really amazed how in the restorative justice world, when you get people into those connective conversations, they get out of their heads into their hearts, and it's almost like they want to say things that build bridges more than walls. Because
Yeah.
it's no more about like getting ahead of the other person or asserting yourself against them. But sometimes in a mediation, people have to do that at the front end just to feel like they're voicing what's important to them. Um,
Really good. I studied conflict resolution for a few minutes there and way back. And then we had some people on our salon who teach it for years. And what I learned many years ago was it's not you versus them or them versus you. It's you and them versus the problem. It's like, yeah. So we'll probably get into that more. I loved your use of the word empathy there, and your observations of humans in general. I know it's a stupid question and it's both, but are we more feeling beings or more thinking beings?
Well, on the Myers-Briggs, I split down the middle on those two. So I'm going to have to go, we're both.
Yeah. And but I would say you're adding that third, because most people would, I think, put intuition in feeling.
Yeah, it's not.
And it's not. I understand what you said. That's really, it's a great differentiation. Where'd you get that intuition is not feeling? From studying or on your own?
One of my best college friends, um, and he ended up being a roommate. I always admired him because I felt like he had better intuitions than me. And then when I was old enough to even think about my intuitions, I realized that I never followed them. I was always like, uh, like evading them and not honoring them. And the older I've gotten, I've learned how to really listen to my intuitions and then really try to follow them. And it really has nothing to do with your feelings. It has to do, again, with the information that you're soaking in through all of your senses. And then having the hunch of what's in your best interest, kind of in that Taoist way, to kind of like glide with the flow of things. Let water go downhill without resisting it, and trusting that that's going to lead to the better outcome than any other pathway.
Yeah. But how did you learn to listen to intuitions? It's a general gradual change. Was there a tipping point? Was there a something that kicked you over?
This might be an analogy. I think around the time I realized I was tuning in more to my intuitions was the same time I was tuning into some health issues. And I started judging food not by what it was like, what food was like in my mouth, but judging food by what it was like in my gut. In other words, if I ate bread, I would judge the quality of that bread not by its taste in my mouth, but by its posture in my stomach. And I started to learn that the best sourdoughs go really easy into the stomach, and you can just keep eating and eating and eating. You don't get that full feeling. But if you eat, just highly processed white flour bread, I mean, I can take one bite and I'm ready to spit it out because my body is saying, I don't want more of it. So I started to trust those impulses of what was healthy food and not healthy food based on how it felt in my stomach.
Yeah, that's amazing. I really want to go into that. I guess we might as well keep the thread going and go off the script for a second because this is amazing. Because I've juiced cabbage for 20 years, and I had a what I call the yuppie stomach disease, where they all take omeprazole, and it's like either Pepto Bismol or omeprazole or whatever. And then, my two heroes, Zappa and Joyce, died of duodenal ulcers. And then they said, well, ulcers are no longer caused by worry, it's something else. And then the health food guy said, juice cabbage. And like for 20 years, I've really believed in juicing cabbage, and I think it works. But I love this thing that you said, just to give you a little background. And it goes to the when I'm talking to people about music, but again, it can apply to literature, food, music. My friend says the 3 T's in music are technique, theory, and taste. So technique is you learn how to play the guitar. Theory is you know what chords to play, and taste. How does one acquire taste? And so that's amazing that you brought this up by saying gut, because a lot of people say it's in your gut. It's like, well, they don't know. How do you know what's in your gut until you've been exposed to it? So
Mm-hmm.
most people say, how do you develop taste? They go exposure, experience. But some
Mm-hmm.
people go, nope, it's all gut. Well, how can you, so if you can just discuss that idea, because you've gravitated towards certain literature, you have a taste for it. How do you navigate that use of that word gut and stomach that you just use in navigating taste towards things like literature?
Well, I'll give an example. I'll give two examples of literature. When C.S. Lewis was 16 years old, he was on a train station platform and was waiting for the train, and he stumbled upon a book rack that had a book by George MacDonald, the Victorian author. He had never heard of this author before. The book title was Fantastes, which is kind of an adult fairy tale. And he bought it and he started reading it. And in his later journal, he said, my imagination was first baptized by this book. And it opened him up to a whole new quality of writing, which I think was very much in his gut. That he said, this is a different kind of literature that speaks to what it means to be, it speaks to goodness.
Yeah.
It's kind of like what Tolkien's Lord of the Rings did for a lot of people. It helped them live in a moral universe.
Yeah.
And I had a similar experience when I was 21. I was in Edinburgh and I came into a used bookstore and I stumbled on a C.S. Lewis book called Pilgrim's Regress, which is the first book he wrote after he converted around the age of 30. And that book was like way over my head. But when I started reading it, it's like at a gut level, I said, there is something in this book that's for me. I don't know how to put words to it, but it speaks to me. And I've had to reread it like 4 or 5 times. But those are two literary examples where, at a gut level, you encounter something that you have to go further into.
Yeah.
But it's like way beyond your level of understanding.
Beautiful. Really articulated well. Thank you, Ted. So two questions from Alan Turing, 1950s. Is thinking a function of the soul?
I wish I could get Owen Barfield to answer that one. he was a friend of C.S. Lewis who became an anthroposophist and thought a lot about that issue. And I don't think I've thought enough about it to give a very good answer.
That's fine. That's all right. Let's move on then. The second question by Turing is, can machines think?
Ooh. And is there a ghost in the machine?
There, you won, Ted. The whole purpose of this series is to invent new questions.
Well, one of my new thought leaders is Paul Kingsnorth from Ireland. He actually just became a Christian a year ago after being involved in ecological activism and a variety of other traditions and whatnot. But he is now doing a series called The Machine, and he's using the word machine in a much broader metaphoric way, kind of like D.H. Lawrence and Lewis Mumford, as representative of the modern mega value frame that sucks everything into its realm to be kind of obedient to mechanistic values of efficiency, values of progress. And so I would say the hardware does not think as human beings, but you could say that the framework that involves beliefs and values and demands human sacrifice has a type of thought dimension.
It's good.
And I don't know if anyone's ever going to really understand if there's even volitional or sentient aspects to what we call the powers and principalities that relate to institutions. But I do believe that whenever there are structures in society that take on a grandiose dimension, like an ideology or an ism, that it's almost like they do have a thought dimension that dictates groupthink.
Yeah. Do you more pursue happiness or more pursue meaning?
I'm probably more of a meaning trekker.
Does the brain more detect consciousness or create consciousness? Like, is consciousness there bubbling away and we're detecting it, or are we actually creating it?
I think it's probably always symbiotic, both.
Yeah.
Um, kind of like what the anthropologist Clifford Geertz said, that human beings are always creating models of and models for. So there are always models reflecting, but at the same time, models are always shaping. And I think human consciousness is probably the same kind of dynamic of both receiving and giving. We're constantly influenced, by a host of things, and we're constantly influencing things around us. So it's always both and for me.
What's faster, speed of light or speed of thought?
Boy, you're throwing some new ones at me here, Jerry. It's like, and for your audience, these aren't like prep questions by any means.
Well, what do you think?
What do you? I'm thinking like, what would Spock say?
Ah, well, we can move on then. Talk about poetry. Audre Lorde said, you can't dismantle the master's house using the master's tools. Yvonne Rainer responded to her and said, you can if you expose the tools. What new tool do you suggest? Now, just to put it in context, Ted, it doesn't matter if it's new. I throw in the word new. You put all these questions into the context you want. You don't have to apply the cute quotes I put beforehand, but it's basically, what tool do you suggest to dismantle the master's house? Or what tool do you gravitate towards now? It doesn't even have to be dismantling the master's house.
Yeah, I mean, my brain first is going to like deconstructing a house in our postmodern world, so you got crowbars and whatnot. But I think where I want to take it more is that I'm gonna say flashlight.
Nice.
Rather than crowbars taking it down, I just want flashlights that go into the dark places of the house and just shine a light where maybe light doesn't want to be welcomed. Because I really feel like one of the things that's gripping modern society is the fact that so much has to be done in the closet, hidden in the dark, and no one wants those things to be found out, because as soon as they're found out, it's sort of like things become sort of like a house of cards. They're not propped up by all the mystery and obfuscations that so much propaganda relies upon. So when you can take a flashlight and shine it on things, it starts to disarm the power that they generally have.
I love it. One of George Clinton's disciples studied the song Flashlight by Parliament Funkadelic. And he said, it could be verb noun, flash the light, flashlight, or it could be the whole noun, a flashlight, an object that is. So I love that word. What do you worry about when you go to bed at night?
Currently, I worry about casework that I take on. I'm a facilitator, and I might at times do facilitation work for harming and harmed parties or people in dispute. And if it's a long-term case, I worry about is this case going to end well or not? I worry about the trauma that gets sort of re-triggered and resurfaced for people when they enter into resolution processes. Is that going to be too much for them to handle? And as a facilitator, you end up absorbing a lot of that residual conflict and pain from people's pasts, and you got to do something with that until there's good resolution.
Is there a difference between worry and concern? And if so, what is it?
I would put worry more in the negative zone and concern maybe a little more positive. To worry is to get kind of in a rat's wheel where you just keep spinning, and it takes a lot of energy out of you, but it doesn't necessarily bring you to any new place. Whereas I think concern is probably a little more grounded, a little more cerebral. In my book, concern leads to responsibility. And I always highlight in my trainings that the word responsibility is based on two words, response and ability, which means that to be responsible for things, you have to be responding to something new, something that you've heard, something that you've learned, and then you've got the ability to take it the next step, to do something about it.
Boy, that is productive words there. Thank you, sir. McLuhan learned from Ezra Pound, the poet, that artists are the antenna of the race. They're broadcasting and detecting the hidden psychic effects of our inventions so that we can learn how to cope with what we don't like about these inventions. So, Ted, I asked you the question Marshall probed his entire career. Why do we ignore the hidden psychic effects of our inventions, even though the artists are broadcasting them to us?
It's too costly to live into more positive alternatives.
Well, suss that out. What do you mean by costly? Is that totally economic or more?
Part of being a cool modern is to be in the know. And if you like artists, you're in the know about what you can critique, what you can deconstruct. You're in the know about proper language. You're in the know about, all of the latest this or that on the creative edges. But that doesn't necessarily build a new world that's healthier. And so I guess what I'm saying is that it's a lot safer for people to just stay in the know, deconstructive way of being in the modern world without really having any investment to make sacrifices to create a better alternative world.
Yeah.
In other words, to reconstruct.
Yeah.
What's the point of deconstructing if you don't give energy into reconstructing? And so I think the trap of the artist is that, yeah, you can reflect the death of a culture, and I can appreciate that. But then what? You're still participating in a technological world. You're still participating in a world that's corporately run.
Yeah.
So what then? It's like you have to kind of ask, is that all the further you go, watching late night talk shows and you're in the know and kind of with the right group? So what?
No, it is so what? It's like you really got my mind going. Beautiful. It just went fractal city, because I do study modern art and I love it. I mean, it's all Duchamp clones. It's like, yeah, duct tape a banana to a wall and charge $100,000 for it, and do an NFT, which again is Duchamp. No freaking thing, and Bitcoin, and who can, do this. But in general, when I said artists, I meant poets, filmmakers, musicians, everything. So there's a big range there, and that was good. Do artists, and you know what I mean by artists? I mean the art of what you do. You're an artist in your own world, and the poet, in the pop star, and the Netflix person. Do artists have moral obligation?
Yeah, because they're prophetic. Whether they like it or not, they're either prophetic or they're in the task of creating beauty. So, I look at Bob Dylan's early music as having that prophetic element. Uh, he led a whole contingent of the '60s forward with his folk style, and um, he called things into question, and said the times are changing. So there's a huge role for that person, and I think the problem is that people can get into just admiring someone because they're powerful or because they're a celebrity in the music world, and they don't necessarily go the next step to let it really speak to their own lives. Like, how do I now change based on those lyrics, or how do I live into those lyrics more?
Yeah,
So
really.
the best of artists kind of do that without even you knowing it.
Yeah.
uh, and I'll give an example here. um, I was a real fan of U2 when they first started doing their music in the late '70s and then early '80s. And this kind of goes back to where I said, the Lord of the Rings has a moral universe quality to it. And when I started listening to early U2 music, it gripped me on a moral level, but it was still an aesthetic level. And it wasn't just because of the lyrics, it was because the power of the art spoke to me in a way that said, you don't have to just plateau out with your own weaknesses or issues or addictions or whatever. You can go higher.
Yeah.
You can be vigilant, you can thrive, you can go higher than you normally are. And that's the power of really good art. You don't even know why, but it just kind of like starts to pull you into a higher zone.
Really well put. Yeah, the artist McLuhan's main revelation was new criticism. The artist is the last person to ask what their art's about. They don't know. They don't necessarily have to know. They just create it, and then the user is the content. Because, like, Masters of War definitely provoked a lot of us to be pacifist. And Dylan would go, I didn't, they want to blame him for he disowns it. They said 45 years ago, they said, if you could sell any product with your music, what would you sell? And he said, women's underwear. 45 years later, he sold some songs to Victoria's Secrets. So it's like people like, he's a sellout. It's like, oh my God. And Patti Smith selling luggage, full pads in the Wall Street Urinal. And I'm like cringing. And 90%, 95% of my friends go, she might need the money. I'm like, give me a break. But it's not me to judge. It's a beautiful thing. It's all good.
That's
So,
funny. Did I hear you say the Wall Street Urinal?
yeah, I slipped. Sorry.
That's a
Are,
good
are,
Freudian slip, huh?
yeah. Well, it's like Michael Moore says, the Wall Street Journal is the enemy's tip sheet.
Oh.
It's actually, they're great writers. So are you more afraid of old ideas or more afraid of new ideas?
I'm starting to tip toward being more afraid toward new ideas.
Can you conjure your earliest memory up, or at least
Oh,
one of them?
don't change the subject now. You're hitting a really bullseye when you ask if I'm afraid of old or new ideas.
Oh, okay. I'll go ahead. Go ahead. Yeah.
Well, yeah, and feel free to ask more, but that's huge. I often say that one simplistic way to distinguish conservatives and liberals is that huge generalization, but liberals generally want to push off the old to embrace the new, and conservatives want to push off the new to embrace the old.
I see.
And I think we're in really interesting times around that because up until the pandemic, you kind of had, pretty clear lines between liberals and conservatives, even though those were like dirty names or dirty words in each other's camp. I've noticed that in the last 2-3 years, you're seeing a lot more. You could say crossovers or people who are becoming like unexpected bedfellows, or mixtures or combos. However you want to talk about it, the whole traditional conservative liberal cleavage line is starting to change.
Yeah.
And I'm going to give a really interesting example for this. Canada has this, or I don't know if it's a government supported thing called the Horizons something, but you can YouTube something that's about 5 minutes long called Shared Reality. And it's got kind of this monotone mechanistic voice that does the script layover, and then it's all visuals going through. And for the most part, it's all about people adjusting to a new world, a new way of being in a future that's kind of like going beyond all of our current troubles. And it assumes that things like AI and human technological interfacing is going to keep increasing and whatnot. And then it gets to a Tower of Babel image. Now, the Tower of Babel happens to be my favorite Bible story, Genesis 11. And I kid you not, it actually makes people coming to the Tower Project, puts that in the positive, because that's now like the future of people collectively uniting together to work on a future project. And it puts God in the bad guy zone for disrupting that project. Complete reversal of the biblical narrative, which is, God kind of saying, hey, you humans, you're not recognizing your own limits, and now I'm going to disperse you and confuse your language. McLuhan would have a heyday with this one.
Yeah.
So that's why I'm more afraid of the new than I am of the old right now.
It's really well put.
That's like changing the narrative almost through double speak, reversals, and posing that as the wave of the future.
Yeah, and I appreciate you listening closely because I switched to the next question, and that was good. You said, hey, I want to suss this out, because I will tell you, Ted, the roots of that question are sort of interesting. John Cage says, I can't understand why people are frightened of new ideas. I'm frightened of the old ones. And then the guy who invented the intermittent windshield wiper, Charles Kettering, said, people are very open-minded about new things as long as they're exactly like the old ones.
Yeah. Well, I've got kind of an anecdote that fits in with this. In the 50s, C.S. Lewis was asked to give a commencement speech to a group of graduates, or maybe it was incoming, a group of students at Oxford. I can't remember what, but in his speech, he basically said, what you have before you right now is a specimen of the medieval world, because I actually think like the people did in the medieval times. and that's the worldview that I feel most accustomed in.
Yeah.
And he said, if you want to really study this kind of specimen, before we dinosaurs become extinct, take advantage of it, because
Yeah.
we aren't going to be around that much longer.
It's really, really well put. And in that regard, I will go to the next question now, Ted. Can you conjure up your earliest memory ever, or one of them?
Yeah. Massachusetts, Lexington, across the street from the house we lived, and I'm probably two, walking along in the woods, kind of along a little stone pathway next to this canal that had water in it. And the combination of woods and stone and water has just always gripped me ever since.
Really heavy. I have this vision from somewhere. I was raised in Michigan. Was you build a stone house in the woods next to a river, and when you put the last stone in, you die.
Well, you got my three elements
I
there:
know,
water,
that's what I was
stone,
amazed.
and
Yeah,
greenery.
wood, stone, and water. Yeah, that was
Yeah, and
good.
by the way, those are the three elements of a Japanese garden.
Yes. Ooh. Is memory more a curse or more a blessing?
For me, it's more of a blessing.
Can you tell me tell me someone within your immediate family and then outside your immediate family, just briefly, who had an impact on you like a role model, and what specifically was that impact?
And I can go outside of relatives too, like someone who is part of our family.
You can put it in. Yeah, when I say immediate family, you can put it into the context you want, Ted. Yeah.
Well, when I grew up in a missionary family in Portugal, um, and very close to our family was a man named Art Brown, who now lives in Chicago. He's probably pushing 99 right now, and he's still active, and he's still driving around. um, he is an incredible role model for me because he was just this amazing transcender, and he had a capacity as a pastor minister to make his enemies into his friends. And he told me all these stories about people who would like get fed up with him or want to leave his church because he was kind of a maverick. And then he would loop around and still engage them conversationally. And a few months or maybe sometimes a few years later, they're turning into friends. And so this idea of not hanging on to things that kind of keep electricity between people, he found ways to kind of ground out that electricity and affirm something in someone who didn't want to be around him, and all of a sudden they're like hanging out together. And I've heard like 3 or 4 anecdotes to that effect that have always amazed me.
That really anticipates something we're going to get into in a second. So that was the one you considered inside your family, now outside your immediate family.
Well, he's not a blood relative, but he was family. He played
Yeah.
cards with us and had popcorn and fudge with us on weekend nights when we were in our missionary home.
Right.
And he played the accordion.
You mean Art?
His
Brown.
name is Art Brown.
Yeah, but I'm saying another role model besides Art Brown. That was, I was considering you were calling Art Brown inside your family.
I was.
Now, yeah, so now a role model who's outside your family that had an impact on you.
I'll pick a guy named Larry Hesed.
What'd you get
Kansas.
from Larry?
He gave me the gift of of being a gentle soul, and yet a very grounded person. And I'm also in debt to him because he gave me my vocation in restorative justice, peacemaking dialogue, mediator, facilitator work. He basically opened up the door and said, Ted, you want to walk through this door? And I became a first paid staff person. So practically, he gave me the gift of my vocation back in the 90s. But on a deeper level, he gave me the gift of being an extremely gentle, humble person,
Yeah.
and a very grounded, balanced person. For years, I watched him try to throw 100 free throws in a row. I watched him hit 99, 98, 97, and finally, I ended up moving from Kansas to Oregon. But I remember shortly after I left, he hit 100 in a row.
Oh, it sounds like he deserves it. You know, you just saying deeper level is exactly what I really aspire to in these. So I appreciate that. Did your parents raise you a particular religion?
Baptist evangelical,
Do you pray?
I do.
If God exists, what do you want God to say to you after you die?
Hey, don't we want to go back to the Baptists before we?
You go for it, dude. Yep.
When people hear Baptist evangelical, they think uh, straight laced, rigid, moralistic, conservative. The thing about my parents is that they grew up in those kinds of conservative worlds, but they became kind of cosmopolitan in their own way. My dad starred in Gilbert and Sullivan shows when he was in high school,
Wow.
and my mother ended up playing violin and going all the way from small town South Dakota, kind of like Music Man town, to Chicago, where she met my dad. Um, and after the war, I mean, they were truly part of the greatest generation. They could do anything they wanted, and and they would go to opera. And so my brother and sister and I, we kind of grew up not so much in that closed, tight, moralistic zone because they gave us a lot of independence. In Portugal, we could walk all around this town where we lived. We could be independent and free to kind of live our own lives. And that was a real gift that they gave. And then culturally, they took us through Europe. We saw museums and all sorts of stuff that most Baptist evangelicals don't get when they grow up.
That's beautiful. So you flushed out a big comprehensive picture of the world. It wasn't, if God exists, what do you want God to say to you after you die?
I appreciate that you valued our relationship even when you screwed up so much.
That's good. Do evil people exist, or does evil use people as a vehicle?
It's always both. Um, but then again, I have my own capacity for evil too. So um, it's not like I can just project evil away from me or outside of me. If it's real, it's also part of something I participate in and have potential in as well. Um, I don't know if you're asking a metaphysical question there or more of a.
Oh, Ted, the follow-up question's a little, let's go into that, but it's interesting what you said because mostly 80%, 90% of people say everybody's capable of evil. All humans are capable of evil. So this question is, how do you advise someone to deal with an enemy? You touched on this a little. And I'm going to open this one up with a few modern thinkers' thoughts. Alan Watts says, if you acknowledge your enemy, you empower them. Coppola stole from the mob and the samurais. Keep your friends close and your enemies closer. JFK said, forgive your enemy, but don't forget their name. And Fellini says, I need an enemy. It's a lot of thoughts. The basic question is, how do you advise someone to deal with an enemy? But first, how would you respond to Alan Watts? If you acknowledge your enemy, you empower them.
Yeah, I would. I probably don't agree with that, um, unless you're acknowledging them kind of on their terms. In other words, like on a simplistic level, if you meet someone who's threatening to you and you acknowledge them by being afraid of them because that's what they expect, in a way you are empowering them because that's the pattern they're anticipating. And they want you to be off guard. They want you to be kind of afraid. But if you acknowledge them with humor or something off guard or something that kind of surprises them, now you're not acknowledging them on their terms, you're acknowledging them on your terms. And that disempowers what they're used to and it kind of befuddles them. And so I like the idea of you kind of change things up a little bit, whether it's verbally or gesture or something like that, and even not even showing that you've got dread of them, but you're energetically kind of playful or a gesture or something, which, not that you wouldn't be intensely aware of things on the inside, but on the outside, you can choose to go down different pathways and not play by their games.
Well put, beautiful. James Joyce was the first projectionist in Dublin 100 years ago. He basically checked out. He said, this is stupid. Why should I go inside a building and see a movie of a tree when I can go outside and see a real tree? Years later, Faulkner said, sometimes the best fiction is more true than journalism. Why do we have to recreate things in order to get them? Why do we have to go to a theatrical play of people acting out life? Why don't we just live life?
That's a big one there. I mean, why do we have to decorate our daily tools?
Yeah.
We're symbolic beings. And part of being symbol bipeds is that it's not enough for us just to be with nature. There's something about being human beings that symbolically we have to add something to it. But obviously, if what we add is a counter nature, we're going to get a kickback, just like we get a kickback from a horse or a cow if we don't work with it right. But that doesn't mean as human beings we just be with horses and cows. I mean, we domesticate them. We add something to nature in order for us to thrive better as human beings. I think farming is a good example of that, where on one level we are adding to what nature does by working with its rhythms. We have to respect its seasons. We have to respect the fact that soils have certain properties that can maximize certain plants to thrive. But if we start to go too far with separating things and messing things up and go down the GMO path, where now we're relying on chemicals or seeds that are controlled by a certain corporation, now we're going to get kickback. And it's when nature kicks back, we better feel it. Because if we don't feel it, we're going to somehow think, oh, nature itself is kind of bad. Now we really have to kind of go the next step and do it better ourselves. Let's grow tomatoes without any soil. Let's not even trust the human immune system, because we can actually better the human immune system by adding some spike proteins to do the job better than what the human immune system was designed to do.
That's right.
Then you're going to get some kickback.
Yeah, let's nurture great people like Rachel Carson to write books in 62 to open up our eyes.
And before she wrote that, DDT had 20 years of positive press.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, I mean, DDT was around, since World War One or so, but it didn't really kick in strong till around the late 30s. And in the early 40s, there was huge ad campaigns and videos that basically said this is safe and effective.
Yikes. So, Ted, walk me through just briefly. Larry sort of inspires and helps you become a mediator in the 90s. Pre to nine, that was sort of a tipping point. You already articulated that was a tipping point. Pre that, what was your route? You were studying to be what, or what was your pursuit in high school and college? And then, like, just take poetry for an example. Did you grow up reading poetry? And then at what point did you go, oh, I could write poetry? Like your tipping point for be a poet. Yeah.
Yeah, well, couple of questions there. For poetry, my dad always tried to get me interested in poetry. He tried to read poetry to me, and I was like really poor at being welcoming for that. I think he was always disappointed. But by college years, I took a couple poetry classes, and then I started writing my own. And then I started outpacing him for poetry that he would write, and um, so that's kind of the short of that one. Um, Probably 2 years ago, I wrote 100 sonnets in 1 year.
Nice.
So it's definitely a big part of my life. Um, for the vocational thing, I kind of burned two bridges, and the short of it is I burned a bridge to go to seminary when I was in my early 20s, and then I ended up getting a master's degree in religious studies at the University of Minnesota. I had a brilliant Marxist teacher named Bruce Lincoln, um, probably the best teacher I've ever had in the field of sociology, religion, and conflict studies. And then I burned a bridge to get a PhD. And at the same time, uh, my wife and I, newly married, she was starting to burn a bridge to go into public education because she was disenchanted with the education field. So we moved out to the Black Hills. Someone said, hey, there's this A-frame you can live in. And we didn't really know where we were going, either of us vocationally. But what was clear is that we were not interested in conventional pathways. So the word alternative was big for both of us. Alternative this, alternative that, alternative eating, alternative education. She ended up becoming a Waldorf teacher, and I ended up in restorative justice, both classic examples of alternative zones of work. And our daughters have kind of lived out that legacy of alternative. One's a tall ship sailor, uh, sailing on the ocean without the use of any enginery, and the other is studying herbal medicines and working on a biodynamic farm.
Nice. Wow, what a beautiful life. So, a screenwriting teacher told me great art, which means poetry, film, music, is when you can clearly see the intention of the maker. Kubrick says the opposite. Great art is when you can clearly not see the intention of the maker. What role does intention play in your creative process when you're writing a poem?
Pretty big. I like to be seen through my work. I have too much of a need for approval and acceptance to not be able to admit that I intend to be the maker behind the made object.
But Well, that's why Duchamp said there's no art without an audience. How much are you thinking of your reader when you're writing your poem?
A lot. Um, yeah, I mean, I used to journal a lot, and I basically, in those days, I didn't really care that I was writing for anyone. It was just kind of a great exercise. But I really can't journal anymore because I'm too hardwired that if I'm going to write, it's going to be for somebody or for some community or for some article. So I'm really good or bad. I'm kind of hardwired into the zone of doing artwork or writing things that's either message oriented or for other people or for this venue. Um, and it's kind of hard for me to get out of that now.
One more question in that regard, writing poetry, Ted. Thank you so much again. This is amazing. McLuhan says, everything we invent extends some humanness. So clothing extends our skin, knife and fork extends our teeth, even non-tangible like religion or philosophy might extend our consciousness. What does the writing utensil extend for you as a poet, whether it's a keyboard or a pencil? What humanness is extended by the writing utensil?
Maybe just the need to participate as a co-creator, to participate as um, someone who wants to work thoughts into an incarnated form.
Yeah. I love that word co-creator. I read that the American Indians, indigenous people, would go from tent to tent and ask each other, what did you dream last night? And then what was articulated was co-created by the question asker. And I said, that's what Finnegan's Wake is. We're co-creating James Joyce's living organism when you read this book out loud with a group of people. It's a co-creation. It's not just Joyce putting a bunch of gobbledygook on a page. It has to be read out loud with a group of people. I love that word co-creator. That was good. So let's go into restorative justice, a little mediator. Utah Phillips says anarchy is making rules for yourself, not others. Who's entitled to make the rules?
Utah Phillips. I haven't heard about him. I heard him live way back at Cafe Extempore in Minneapolis, probably 1981. That's really neat to hear Utah Phillips conjured up.
I know, I love him. He's a
folk hero.
folk hero, definitely.
Yeah, I got distracted just by thinking about him. Ask the anarchy part, the question again.
Yeah, because it's interesting because I asked an anarchy specialist once and he says that's not really true. But I like what Utah Phillips's sentiment is saying is anarchy is making rules for yourself and not others. So the basic question, especially in restorative justice, mediator, who's entitled to make the rules?
You know, from its start, restorative justice pushed off of the legal framework because it felt like the legal world had too many rules. It had too many. It was too law focused. It it was too caught up with details and frameworks and so the language of early restorative justice practitioners is rather than focusing on rules and the law, we're going to focus on the harm done and the personal aspects of the crime or harm. And once you go down the path of focusing more on the harm done, now you have to engage the people who are mostly involved rather than just leave it to professionals who can manage the rules. And so you're in a whole different paradigm zone. Now you're in a zone of human values, of what does it mean to like bring people together for communication, to talk it through, to be empowered to learn about what happened and who was affected and what the repairs can be, rather than just having like a algorithmic formula to match up this harm with this punishment. And that's the power of this work, is it's it's getting to consequences. It still has a high view of accountability, but it wants to get there through the empathy zone, through learning, through listening, through deep connecting, through dignifying people, rather than keeping them apart and just kind of dishing out a punishment. Because that doesn't really help either the victim or the offender. It just sort of keeps them stuck in their with their labels.
Well, when did conflict resolution become a subject that people taught in school? Because over the years, I sort of had to study it because I had falling out with a friend. And I says, well, I got to study what conflict resolution is. And then I thought, why weren't we taught that? I mean, we're not taught the right things in college. We should be taught, conflict resolution. And then I met someone at a McLuhan conference and they go, I've taught conflict resolution for 20 years. So do you know about the history of it actually being taught in college or in high school or college or even grade school?
Yeah, well, prior to college teaching, there has to be societal opportunity. So the 60s gave birth to the mediation model through labor union negotiations. And the 70s gave birth to the restorative justice dialogue, starting in Kitchener, Ontario, a case from 1974 that kind of opened up the whole idea of victims and offenders actually coming together to work things out. And in the wake of those two developments, programmatically, now you have teachers in colleges taking note and starting to develop curriculums around it. The third piece then that comes after those two is international peacemaking. People like John Paul Lederach at Eastern Mennonite University are pioneering models for win-win type negotiated dialogue processes in Central America. So every decade you can kind of see how these things kind of layer up and get more sophisticated, and now it's everywhere. I mean, even Desmond Tutu in the 90s was adopting restorative justice principles, mixing it with some Zulu indigenous principles, and came up with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission model.
Beautiful. Really well summarized. I love it. It's just sort of sad. It took us till the 60s. What were humans doing before the 60s? That's like, dude, get it together. But here's like a deeper question. Does punishment work? So the way I word it is, when a criminal, maybe that's not the right word, a lawbreaker gets caught, do they think they've done something morally and socially wrong, or do they say, oh, my criminal skills weren't up to snuff that day? So in the long run, does punishment work, and how do you deal with that sensibility?
Yeah, my personal opinion is that most men in prison, and I say men because it's 90% in the United States and Canada, because they do not have to confront how their actions have affected other people or communities, that they primarily view themselves as victim of circumstances. Add to that almost all of them were once victimized when they were younger.
Yeah.
Which means that their patterns of coping and misbehaving and hurting other people are part of a deeper backstory of their own traumatic past, where mean actions were modeled to them. That's how they learned to cope. They learned how to get away with things. And so if they're not ever in a zone of learning about how their actions are part of a web of human relationships, you can say, yeah, punishment works because after 10 years, they're going to say, I'm not going to go back to that again. But that's a disincentive. It doesn't necessarily rewire your thinking about how you fit into society. it doesn't give you respect for how other people are impacted, just like you were impacted when you were a boy. So what restorative justice offers is a way to start to break those cycles of victimization and offending, just like in the recovery world. It's like it's all wrapped together why people have addictions, and they have to come to terms with both their wounding and their wounded selves if they're really going to be able to make some serious changes.
Wow, there's a lot packed in there, wounded selves. So I got to go back to poetry for a second and see if we can connect the two, because Louis Bersani, he just passed away. He did a study of Mallarmé, the great symbolist poet. He said, the very crises which threatens the writing of poetry sustains poetic composition. So I wonder how that applies, because last week I interviewed a guy who, was a theater guy from day one, and eventually he fell into teaching theater in prisons. And he says these guys are just there. they're like primed for, what you were almost saying, coping with trauma. They're like, this is like a perfect situation for them to cope with their trauma by doing theater.
Mm-hmm.
So just crossing over into your field and being a poet, how do you respond to this line? The very crises which threatens the writing of poetry sustains poetic composition.
I guess what I'm hearing in that is that there are elements in our society that rub against the poet, kind of like friction, um, because it doesn't really want to welcome the poet. And yet, um, that friction in itself becomes part of the generative elements that give extra life to the poet. It almost like vindicates the need for the poet.
Yeah.
And so, I don't know, there's kind of a paradox there, I guess.
Yeah.
It's the same with the prophet. The prophet is always unwelcomed, and yet that unwelcoming is the raison d'etre of the prophet's role.
What's more important, Ted, conviction or compromise?
Conviction.
You've accomplished a lot in your life. Rate these three elements: luck, skill, and ambition. What played the biggest role, second and third?
Uh, Luck isn't really part of my glossary, and ambition is not part of my glossary. Um, Skills probably would be at the top because I have worked at people skills, I've worked at writing skills, I've worked at facilitation skills, I've worked at building what I call social capital. So I'm by no means a capitalist, but I understand the merits of building social capital relationally with people so that years later you have connections that you draw from, and there's sort of like a give and take that happens when you invest in relationships, even in a work context.
T.S. Eliot said poetry is outing your inner dialogue. What language is your inner dialogue in?
The Psalms.
Wow. Is perception reality?
It is when you look at a rainbow.
Great. That is good.
Barfield.
Is that who said that?
That's part of Owen Barfield's whole thing. Yeah, it's always both.
Yeah. I like Richard Brautigan, that poet, he said, everybody has their roles in the world. Mine is clouds. So two of my film heroes say this thing: ignore yourself. There's no self-expression. Great jazz pianist Cecil Taylor says, I'm just a vehicle, and this stuff just comes through me. And again, it's a stupid question, and it's both, but is art making more self-expression or more you're a vehicle for whatever technology, culture, or environments are dominant?
You're probably going to get bored if I keep giving you both and answers.
No, that's totally okay. It's totally
I'm
okay.
a mediator. I'm always like looking for the win-win. Of course, it's
Yeah.
a little of this, it's a little of that.
No, it's just the jumping off point. You don't
Yeah.
have to saying both is fine.
No, I think one way I'd look at it, the creative process does involve muses, and we are vehicles in a sense, because if we're not in tune with something greater and beyond, then it becomes too much about us orchestrating everything. And yet the counterbalance to that is that we are amazing individuals. We're not just cogs in the a set of wheels. We are individuals. That's why the word co-creator in a Jewish Christian context is a really important concept, because it actually values the individual as having some autonomy and some agency. So, and yet if it's just the individual with pure autonomy and pure agency, then that's kind of false too, because uh, there's not much humility if you don't realize we're part of a huge, vast universe that has so much unknown stuff, and we're part of a vast history, and we're codependent on all sorts of things in our society. So we're vehicles and we are individuals.
That's the great Monty Python line. The guy's speaking to thousands, and he goes, repeat after me. We are all individuals. And the whole crowd goes, we are all individuals. And one guy goes, not me. Okay. Can art making be egoless?
If you're a good Taoist master, it can be.
Whoa. There's no right or wrong answers to any of these questions, Ted. That one you got right.
Well,
Hey,
let me say a little more.
Sue, sure.
Outside of me having Christian identity, classical Taoism is probably warmest to my heart as a tradition. I just think the world of that tradition. So the Tao Te Ching, Chung Tzu, Weng Tzu, all of that is like, whoa. There is just these people thought about life, and they understood what it meant to accept natural law. And to me, it's a little different than Buddhism. I mean, I have great respect for Buddhism, but for me, Buddhism is too subjective. The reason I like Taoism is it assumes an objective world of natural law and the realm of the Tao. And then as the individual finds themselves in the midst of that objective world, they have to participate in it with kind of this free-flowing, non-contriving way. What a balance. What a balance that is. And that's the tradition that gave rise to Tai Chi, and even Kung Fu, because these are the arts of like working with the energy of things rather than being oppositional. I find the paradoxical nature of the classical Taoists, the whole non-action as a way of being, to be very fitting with the paradoxical teachings of Jesus and Paul.
Wow.
That through vulnerability, you really have a greater strength. Through what the world views as foolishness, you have greater wisdom. Through giving things up, you actually retain things. and amazing affinity of thought there between those traditions.
Sure learned a lot there. That was beautiful. That really inspired me. So Ted, I asked for 90 minutes. We got 10 more minutes. Can you go? Can you go more than 10 more?
I can go longer, and I think we talked a little bit about talking about the paralysis of dialogue in our current times.
We can do that. If we do this finish up in 15, 20 minutes with this interview, we could do the paralysis of time in a future salon and just suss it out deeper and even bring in a couple other people who know this.
Paralysis of dialogue.
I mean, paralysis of dialogue. Sorry.
Yeah, that's a huge interest of mine these days.
Yeah, and I know you're probably going to bring it up, or you can in the next 20 minutes, but I'm just saying, keep in mind, this has went so well. It's almost like I would love to do a part 2 just on the interview, but I like to do this sort of basic interview once, and then we can go off and do future salon Zooms, because this is, you really, in fact, I'll just jump into this point because it is on your emails. To exist is to resist. Now, before you tell the history of that, I'm going to put it in the context of my question. You create what you resist. That's a saying. Bob Goldthwait, the comedian, morphed it into you are what you hate. James Joyce said, it's a curious thing how your mind is super saturated with the religion in which you say you disbelieve. And Louis Buñuel said, thank God I'm an atheist. So this whole idea of you create what you resist, and to exist is to resist. Just suss out what that means to you or your feelings on those.
Well, I'll say a few personal things, then I'll talk about the derivation of that phrase. We don't live in a harmonious world. We live in a world that's full of tensions and challenges and binary oppositions. And so part of existing is always you having to come up against stuff. And so I think for me personally, without realizing that you can actually be strengthened when you go against something, kind of like when you're swimming against the tide. I actually was swimming with a friend today in a pool with a waterfall, and as you swim toward the waterfall, the current is so strong, you stay in one place while you're swimming. And so that's a picture of resisting, but you're still strengthening yourself in the midst of that activity because you're wanting to go forward rather than just be carried away. And my feeling is that in modern society, if you don't have some feeling of resistance, you will just get carried away or swept along.
So that is like you create what you resist in a way. You put yourself in this situation, or you're in this situation, and even though you're saying, like Joyce said, even though you're super saturated in saying you disbelieve this religion, it's so much a part of you. So then does that reinforce to exist is to resist, or is it different? And what's the origin of that phrase you use on your email?
Well, I use it because I'm the executive director of the Jacques Ellul Society, the International Jacques Ellul Society, and that's a phrase that he used often. But it actually originates from Jose Ortega y Gasset, or Gasset. I'm not sure how you pronounce that, if that's French or Spanish, but it was an important mantra for Ellul because for him, without resistance, you are just carried along, like I said, by the currents of our modern technological society. And it wasn't because he was against technology per se. He was against the whole concept of the value systems that get prized when a technological society starts to trump all other traditional worldviews and ways of thinking, and says that the values of efficiency and progress and speed are the most important. Therefore, if you can invent it, invent it. There's really no more ethical boundaries for what you can do technologically. If it can be done, it's okay for it to be done. And so to resist in that kind of non-moral climate is a very conscious thing. It's like you are placing yourself in a stream to go against it. And without that, he had a pretty pessimistic view of where technological values will take the modern Western world.
And it raises a question, McLuhan says everything humans invent have services and disservices. And we want to suss out, he said, understanding is not having a point of view. You don't say, I love Facebook or I hate Facebook when you're with one or more people. When you're alone, you can say, I love or hate it. But when you're with one or more people, you want to suss out how it's shaping our behavior so we can cope with what we don't like about it. But one time I said that to a woman, I says, every human invention has services and disservices. She goes, what's the service to a torture rack? And so it was actually when Eric McLuhan was living. So I emailed him. I says, what should I say? It's like, well, there's a million. If you make torture racks, it helps you sustain and pay your rent and buy your house or whatever. But it could stretch your body. But I have trouble with them saying every tool has services and disservices, but I believe it's true. They invent the atom bomb. I'm not for bombs. I'm not for guns. But, it is an interesting phenomenon. It's almost like what you just said, right? If somebody can dream something up to invent it, that's human creativity, right? Or am I wrong?
Well, if there's no ethical boundaries to limit a certain activity, because you're not able to say this could be too dangerous if we go down this pathway, then everything is kind of experimental in the name of humanity, big H, or in the name of the collective. And so what worries me is the phrase the benefits outweigh the risks.
Yeah.
Because where do you draw the line there when you get used to that phrase? I heard that a lot on NPR. When they pull in the health expert, or before the vaccine rollouts, they'd always have the expert that usually had a favorable perspective, and invariably, if you listen very closely to like a 5-minute report, at the end you always heard the phrase, the benefits outweigh the risks, which means that if you are in the risk category for an adverse effect, well, that's part of your service to the collective. Because if we don't go down this path of medical solution, there'll be a greater cost. So it's always justified in terms of the greater good.
Yeah.
But where the heck do you draw a line between risks and benefits?
Yeah.
If you can't, then it's like whoever wants to be in charge of the new solution can make it seem as good as possible for the good of the whole. And that kind of reasoning really worries me.
Yeah. Lewis Carroll said, I believe as many as 6 impossible things before breakfast. Have you believed in any impossible things lately?
I try to believe in the impossible positive outcomes of some of the hard restorative justice cases I take on, because sometimes I say, it's going to take a miracle if there's really a good outcome here. But then I have to remind myself it's not about me doing the work. I just hold space. It's about other people like seeing the opportunity to make it possible. So that's kind of the one zone I think about the impossible is healing outcomes for the people I work with.
Yeah, beautiful. Tell me, Ted, one major element of your restorative, you being a mediator, that's changed, and one major element that stayed the same since you started doing this in the 90s.
A big one for me that's changed is the whole concept of hearing and being heard. Um, in the 90s, I probably would have thought that communication is sending and receiving, it's speaking and listening, and if that's respectful, then good things will come out of it. In the last 3-4 years, I've realized there's really a whole third dimension of communication. And in addition to speaking and listening, there's being heard, which is what the speaker receives back, a type of validation or being understood. And until people experience that at a deep, profound level, they usually get stuck to the past. But when they get the gift of being heard well, and feel satisfied with it, then shift happens. Shift with an F.
Yes, that's a great word.
Shift happens in this field when people are heard well. And that's a big change for me. I didn't really have that perspective when I started this work. And I'm really thankful for that new element, because now I see, even in my personal life, I work at echoing back what I hear other people say, because I know that's meaningful to them to feel like they've really been understood.
Yeah. So Moshe Feldenkrais works with healing and movement. He says it's literally possible to identify a weakness and incorporate it to become a strength, rather than we're normally taught to overcome a weakness. Tell me a weakness you turned into a strength.
I'll capitalize on what I said earlier about intuition. I used to be terrible at either recognizing my intuitions or following them. And it's something I've reflected on for decades. And little by little, just through intention and osmosis, wanting to trust my intuitions, it's turned into a real strength for me.
Yeah.
And frankly, one of the reasons I'm kind of an outlier during these pandemic times is because I do trust my intuitions and my sensory experiences more than I trust a lot of what I get from the media.
Yeah.
And that's put me in an awkward zone, because people think I'm kind of crazy for not either trusting an official narrative, and I don't trust all the reactionary wacko stuff on the counter site either. But I do trust how I think about human immune systems. I observe things. I watch the fact that most people who are getting sick now are vaccinated. I pay attention and I think a lot. And, having that strength of relying on your intuition puts me in kind of a threatening zone in our society, because I really feel that there's a war against human intuition these days.
Yeah.
By obfuscating truth so much with this barrage of confusing information and letting the oppositional information just go back and forth and whatever, it reduces the potential for people to trust themselves. And once you can't trust yourself as an individual with your own thinking, with your own intuition, in my book, things start going downhill there.
Ted, do you think you got that more? I know it's both, but do you think you got from the way your parents raised you, or more on your own?
I think probably more on my own. My parents raised us pretty independently, and so I feel like that's been more of a conscious journey since my college years.
Louis Buñuel says, I'm for anyone who seeks the truth, but I part ways when they claim they found it? Any comment?
I think there's a half truth to that. But what I don't like about it is to think that there is nothing objective out there that creates a way for us to have a rational world to live in. And this goes back to the Taoists.
Yeah.
When they studied the crane and followed the movements of that crane in order to do certain kinds of movements in life or in martial arts, that's an objective reality. That's a truth. And to say that that's all bogus because it's just perception, to me, misses the point. There's a real crane out there that consistently behaves and moves in this way, and it's a source of learning. And I believe that all of nature is part of a created realm that has a spiritual dimension as well, that has objective truths that are not going to be different for everyone who looks at it through different eyes. That's not to say there's not lenses that affect how we view things. But if we give up the idea of objective truth or objective ethics, it's all over for Western society. Even Jean-Paul Sartre said as much.
Ted, just to be clear, when you say Taoism, that's spelled how?
Taoism, and I'm
Thank
thinking
you.
more of the classical,
Yeah.
the writings prior to 0 AD
Yeah.
are the writings that I probably have the most affinity for. I mean, I like aspects of the I Ching and whatnot, but it's the classical writers that are most compelling to me.
Really good things. And one other thing on that regard, the cliche is the journey is more important than the destination. Why do we have to seek a destination or name a destination if the journey is more important?
Well, the journey's hugely important because that's the forming. Journeys are what forms us. The pilgrim life is in the journey. But if there is no destination, this kind of goes back to the objective truth piece.
Yeah.
Then it's kind of like what kind of world do we live in? And if nothing can fully satisfy us because we seem to have longings or desires for things that can't even be realistically fulfilled in this existence, that might be itself a pretty good argument that there is more beyond that.
It's amazing. That Buñuel quote, 99% of people go, oh, that's right. I'm for anyone who seeks the truth, but I part ways when they claim they find it. One guy finally said, that's bullshit. And you saying it's a half truth is even better because McLuhan had the great line, a half of a truth is still a lot of a truth.
I like to see good wherever it can be found. So that's why I'm basically a both and guy.
Yeah.
And most arguments, people simplistically go into these two camps. But if they really think about the positive and negatives in each zone, they would find ways to probably have more commonality and connection.
Yeah. That's Pascal said, in order to understand anything, you have to know this end of the spectrum and that and everything in between. That's what got Marshall to say suspended judgment. Understanding is not having a point of view. You're going to have a point of view, but you don't have to have it when you're with other people so readily that you're missing enlightenment. You can get enlightened. Your enemy's your best teacher, is the American indigenous American Indian. So anger can be a productive emotion when fill in the blank.
When it's expressed without being destructive. When someone has the dignity to be able to slow down and talk with others about where it comes from.
Beautiful.
have other outlets.
Beautiful. Can you forget to die?
I'm trying to right now, and it's not working.
Let's do the 5 Alan Watts questions just briefly in a few words off the top of your head. Who started it all?
Rene Girard.
Oh, that's great. Are we going to make it?
Yes.
Where do we put it?
Put it by a stream bank.
Beautiful. Who's cleaning it up?
Probably some cosmic deity.
Is it serious?
Only if we can laugh with it.
Oh, you are a wise human. Thank you. I just have a few more, Ted. This has been really fun, and I do hope indeed we can do a salon. I know just the people to join us on the paralysis of dialogue. How do you find peace of mind?
I have to usually go somewhere where there's no ceiling, which means take a walk outside. And then I have to feel like I'm connected to what the Bible calls a cloud of witnesses. The fact that I'm not isolated, but there's other people that have experienced what I've experienced, and that gives me a great sense of orientation.
I want to invite you to Venice, California someday and walk on the boardwalk with me, because a lot of my friends are homeless in the boardwalk or houseless, and it's exactly that. It's a cloud of witnesses. It's really an amazing. I always go, this is what heaven is. The boardwalk, you know.
Yeah, I can go with that.
If you were walking down the street today, you met yourself as a 12-year-old, what would you say to your 12-year-old self?
No, I'm trying to even think back to that time. I was so much older then, I'm younger than that now.
That's a good answer. Let's leave it there. Should toilet paper come off the roll over or under?
Under, definitely.
Why?
Because then you can snap rip it with one hand.
If a publisher was to release your autobiography off the top of your head, what would the title be?
It would be something about the confessions of a multi-phrenic postmodern Christian.
They want to scent the glue in the binding. What smell?
Oh, I don't know, patchouli oil maybe.
They want to have a color other than black ink on some of the pages. What color?
A combination of orange, gold and green.
Nice. If a statue was built in your honor, where would you want it displayed, and what would it be made of?
It would be, you mean a bust of me or any kind of
Well,
sculpture?
Yeah, it's the word is statue, so you can put it in the context you want. Bus, anything, whatever. You know, it's some sculpture, public sculpture in your honor.
Well, it would probably be kind of a holy fool jester thing where I would be life-size next to a Tower of Babel.
Nice. Do you know about didn't Umberto Eco write something of Tower of Babel or anyways?
I don't know if he did, but I'm curious to look it up if he did.
Yeah, and because you know, Joyce mentions Tower of Babel in Finnegan's Wake. It's a great image. You're hoiking up beautifully. Ted, tell me something good you never had and you never want.
And I never want?
It's good, you never had it, but you never want it.
Oh. Probably lots of money.
Say,
Although I guess I have to take that back because I probably uh, don't have the most positive attitude towards it either. Um, I don't know. That one's kind of stumping me.
well, no, we can leave it there because that's the three answers I get the most on that. It's money, fame, and heroin.
Ah, serious on the third?
No, seriously. Yeah. I mean, though that's the three answers I get the most on that. Okay. If you were in a vat of vomit up to your neck and someone threw a bag of shit at your face, what would you do?
It sounds like I'd be laughing in the face of death.
That's good. Well, actually, you being a literature guy, you'll love this. This woman on the boardwalk once said, I would take the bag of shit coming at me and I'd use the velocity to swoop me out of the vat of vomit. And I said, that's Descent to the Maelstrom, short story by Edgar Allan Poe. You know,
Wow.
that's how McLuhan opens his first book. We're swirling in information overload. We can actually utilize that and all these advertising techniques to swish our way out of this. You know,
Gosh.
it's sort of like that breakdown into breakthrough, rejection into redirection.
Well, that's a heck of an image you're presenting there, Jerry.
Some people really hate me when I say that question, but I learned it from a very wise person, and it could be like a metaphor for life. But one of my favorite answers also was, I'd never be in a situation like that. What's the cultural shift you see developing today that inspires you?
Uh, I run into younger generation people that really understand the need for local focus and are losing interest in the global.
Yeah.
Um, you know, it's kind of the difference between think globally, act locally. Now
Yeah.
you can kind of put a twist on that and say think locally, act locally.
Yeah.
And I kind of like the fact that there are some younger generation folk in the alternative ways of thinking that are more and more interested about investing in local barter economies and healthy, thriving cultures that are no longer dependent on big this, big that, because the more we're part of the mega systems, the more we're just, fueling those larger things that seem to be getting out of hand.
Yep. William Blake, we become what we behold. Behold your neighborhood and become it. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Couple more and we're out of here, Ted. This has been truly enlightening. Thornton Wilder in 1928 said, art is confession. Art is the secret told. But art is not only the desire to tell one's secret, it's the desire to tell it and hide it at the same time. You've laid your cards on the table for over 90 minutes. I'm not insinuating you haven't answered this. What's it really all about for you, Ted?
Uh, the part where Thornton Wilder said the hidden part.
Yeah.
Is that kind of what this gets at? Like what are the deeper hidden?
Well, it's a funny, stupid question in a lot of ways. I open it with this Thornton Wilder quote that he's saying, you know, art is confession. And I'm sort of implying that there's a secret that you haven't told me. Some people go, what is art all about? Or what is it? Yesterday, art life. So it's not really sequential. It's really, again, you put it in the context you want, because you've been totally honest to me. I mean, actually, I left out one question I'll ask after this and then do the last question, but it's again, you put in the context you want.
Okay.
You know?
Well, I'll see if I can pull this together. Are we winding up with this one?
We got two more after this.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay. I actually had a chance to work with Thornton Wilder's nephew
Nice.
to republish all of his Amos Wilder's books that were out of print. It was kind of a neat project, so I got all sorts of interesting anecdotes about Thornton. And when I was in eighth grade, I was the first time I watched Our Town. And so middle school play, um, where I'd like to kind of take my answer is that the concept of people who have already died being able to speak back, speak to each other, but speak back to life as it's going on and to be more reflective, to me is really a powerful image. That there is something bigger about the way life is on this planet, as if we're all ants just kind of moving around anxiously and trying to grab for this and grab for that. And once people have died and they're like sitting around in the cemetery reflecting back on the bigger issues of life, that's a call for us to actually do some of that before we die. And there's so much going on in our society that pulls us away from that activity of just sitting in that cemetery and thinking about life, thinking about ourselves, thinking about trauma, thinking about patterns, thinking about relationships. And as someone who takes both spiritual and religious life pretty seriously, I really prize anything that helps us be in those contemplative zones, especially if it's with other people. And I think the best of the arts moves us into that space.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, it's deep. There's a lot there. I'd love to hear more about that experiences. So Amos Wilder is Thornton's nephew, and you worked with Amos.
No, Amos is the brother to Thornton.
Oh, he's the brother.
Yeah, I worked with the nephew who was helping to do reprints of all of Amos Wilder's theological books.
Oh, reprints of Amos Wilder's books. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thornton was a huge Finnegan's Wake freak, you know.
Oh, was he?
And Skin of Our Teeth is just like it was just performed in New York in the last month. It's like really based on Finnegan's Wake, you know. And it's good. I mean, Thornton, that's a real deep question. If I can get the person, I mean, you answered it really well, but you know, it's funny how many years I've asked that question. You know, you've presented us with this, but what's it really all about? Because people don't want it. They're like, well, I already told you. My piece says it, you know, but you're trying to get the artist to reveal their secret. They don't want to reveal their secret. They might not know their secret, you know.
Yeah.
But
this fits well with Soren Kierkegaard talked about how God always remains a bit hidden in the context of revealing. And God can't reveal everything. And so there's always some aspect of indirect communication based on that hiddenness. But that also makes for a very dynamic way of God to communicate to human beings, so that it's just not overwhelming or overbearing or it almost like by nature has to have an indirect dimension to it for it to have the capacity for human beings to develop their own agency, their own growth, their own capacity to be co-creators. So I really like that concept about how revelation and hiddenness are always kind of a duality that work together. And so it sounds like artwork can have the same kind of tension.
Yeah. Kierkegaard, that's beautiful. And what you said about people who died speak back to us. There's a great line I love to quote by Paul Krasner. He says, I only believe in reincarnation in one of my past lives.
That's kind of like a Woody Allen line.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Two more and we're out of here, Ted. Really fun. On what occasion do you lie?
I lie all the time to myself. Um, I think we're all the greatest liars with ourselves. Um, but my wife just got in the kitchen, so I better not say much more.
That was good because Tom Waits, they said, on what occasion do you lie? And he says, I didn't know I needed an occasion. And in the other one, this woman was asked, it's a Marcel Proust question. It says, on what occasion do you lie? And this woman said, that's called manners.
But here's something about, you said Marcel, it made me think of Marcel Marceau.
Yeah.
You cannot lie with a mime.
That's good. Yeah, Marcel Marceau in Mel Brooks's movie Silent Movie, he's the only person who says a word.
Yeah, I know. Yeah. I got to see him when I was a kid.
Oh,
that was
God.
pretty special. Yeah.
Okay, last question. Really beautiful. Thank you, Ted. This has been truly enlightening. I really appreciate it. What gives you the most optimism?
Well, I'll try to bring that into the restorative world. What gives me the most optimism is the human capacity to apologize. Because when people can apologize, they resist the normal expectations of protectiveness in society. It's very sacred. It's one of the most sacred things that happens between human beings, because essentially apology is a miniature death that creates a resurrection, and it frees up both the giver and the receiver of an apology. And if people can learn how to practice that with humility and make it more of a norm rather than an exception, it gives me incredible optimism for what this world can become.
What a way to close this out. It's beautiful. I'll tell you, Mark Twain said, forgiveness is the smell the flower releases when the foot steps on it. So I totally agree. I mean, apology, forgiveness, this is what we've been doing. It's about communication and sussing out what our commonality is.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I just love life, and the thing about death is it's so limiting.
Well, I loved your answer to can you forget to die? People freak out when I ask them. They go, what do you mean? I goes, it's a question. Just let me know what you think,
Well, it's fun to be put on the spot. So good for you for having this pattern of interviewing.
Well, thank you, Ted. And I'm going to bug you, and hopefully we'll do a paralysis of dialogue salon.
Good.
Look forward to it. Thank you so much, Ted. I'm going to hit the button end, but I hope this never ends.
Okay, thank you.